Our first lesson comes from Psalm. Hear how the people worshipped in the time of the prophets. You are righteous, O Lord, and your judgments are right. You have appointed your decrees in righteousness and in all faithfulness. My zeal consumes me because my foes forget your words. Your promise is well tried, and your servant loves it. I am small and despised, yet I do not forget your precepts. Your righteousness is an everlasting righteousness, and your law is the truth. Trouble and anguish have come upon me, but your commandments are my delight. Your decrees are righteous forever. Give me understanding that I may live. Here ends the reading of the Hebrew text.
I'd like you to use your imagination this morning as you hear this story about Zacchaeus. He's one of the saints. And as I read this, imagine there's a tree over here, okay? Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through it. A man was there named Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was terribly rich. He was trying to see Jesus, but on account of the crowd, he could not, because he was short in stature. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore tree to see him, because he was going to pass that way. When Jesus came to the place, he looked up and he saw him. Zacchaeus, hurry, come down, for I must stay at your house today. So he hurried down and was happy to welcome Jesus. All who saw it began to grumble and say, "He has gone to be the guest of one of those sinners." Zacchaeus stood there and said to the Lord, "Look, half of my possessions, Lord, I will give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I will pay back 4 times as much." Then Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because he too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Humanity came to seek out and to save the lost." Holy wisdom, holy word. The context this morning is that the gospel writer is addressing the people of the congregation who are suffering under Roman rule. And there's this huge crowd. And Jesus has been going through the land teaching and healing. And in his teaching, he hasn't said very many nice things about the rich. For example, in chapter 6:24, "But woe to you who are rich, for you have received your consolation." In chapter 12, he tells the parable of a rich farmer who hoped to build a bigger barn in which to store his crops, but that very night he's called to account to God. Then later on in the chapters, another parable about Lazarus in heaven and the rich man in hell. In chapter 18, just prior to today's reading, the rich man, a young ruler, walks away from Jesus. And now Jesus, on his way to Jerusalem, where he will die, does something unexpected. Curiously, Zacchaeus, a rich tax collector, defined by the community as a sinner of the worst kind. I mean, we can see him up in that tree, right? Because he is stealing from his own people. He's a collaborator. He rushes to see Jesus. This has always baffled me, but we'll get to that later. He's more like the scandals surrounding subprime housing loans. I don't know about you, but I've had an encounter with someone like that through a friend. And loans that were given to people that it was known by the seller that they couldn't possibly repay. Zacchaeus, like the companies and the salespeople who preyed on those who dreamt of a better life, in doing so, shattered their hopes and their dreams. This gets at the spirit. When you attack the hope of people, you do something to them emotionally and spiritually. So no wonder Zacchaeus was despised. No wonder he was an outcast in the community. I also, in my travels in Palestine, in Gaza specifically, when I stayed there in I think it was 1990 or 1992, I ended up staying, unbeknownst to me and those the group that I was with a collaborator. And I sat with the man, and I'll never forget this. He was in tears. He was fearful. He was afraid for the lives of his family members, but he was also afraid of the community. He was a collaborator. And my heart went out to him because he was repenting and he wanted to change his ways. The people that I was with scorned him. They found him totally disgusting. So there was that tension. And I see and I read that tension in this story today. Sears experiences in oppressive situations and also experiences here at home in terms of how we treat our poor and those who are living on the edge of life. Jesus recognizes Zacchaeus, and he recognizes something coming from Zacchaeus, who's hanging from a tree to see him. Some kind of joyful spirit, perhaps, and invites him to himself to this man's house to share a meal with him. Now, when you share a meal, that means you're friends. This is where we hear that Zacchaeus pledges to give back what he has defrauded people, even more than he needs to by law, which actually wipes out all of his riches. And Jesus forgives him and proclaims him a son of Abraham. In other words, Jesus declares that Zacchaeus is now reinstated as a part of the community from which he had been an outcast. Was this hard to swallow for those observing? You betcha. They had suffered deeply because of this tax collector and thief sanctioned by the state. Looking at this from the eyes of the crowd, of those observing, here's a story that may help us relate. Now, some of you have been hearing about the fires in California, and whenever I think of California, I think of, sorry about this, but I think of surfing in the same way that I think of Hawaii, and that's because a distant relative of mine is married to a lifelong surfer. I think he's now in his 50s. Anyway, he's still surfing. So, Mike is an avid surfer and has been. He's spoken about his passion, and so I watched this movie one time about surfing because of him. And it was about a young boy desiring to take on the largest wave called a maverick. Now, does anybody know about this? Anyone? Oh, at least one of you. Wow. One so high and powerful due to a storm like El Nino. The young man is instructed on how to prepare and approach such a broad and massive wave. First, he must hone his observation skills, study all of what he sees, not just the overwhelming and formidable wave, but its direction, how the currents move and where, changes in the wind and its effects on the direction of the wave. In other words, all the energies at play creating and moving the waves, thus its larger context. Then, when one's ability to understand the interplay of all of these elements chart then a course through to the other side of the wave that at first glance seems formidable. And one of the examples that was shown was where the waves were being blocked by a massive assembly of rocks. And the young man that was observing that, he saw that the waves struck the rocks, that the current shifted and pulled the water back out into the sea, creating an accessible and smoother pathway. To enter the waters at that spot meant that he would only have to use minimal effort as the current would pull him out. This was a rather joyful experience to that surfer, and a wonderful metaphor for dealing with life's formidable storms and challenges. There are times in our lives that all we can see is the looming wave of disaster, insurmountable challenges, the punch in our stomachs from loss, or the shattering of relationships from betrayal or rejection. We may think only we have two choices, to give up or fight, which expends a lot of energy we may or may not have. However, like our surfer, if we observe the entirety of a situation, we may find, with the support or even the guidance of others, that there are ways for us to get through, a path that is easier, one that comes from within the storm itself, within our own turmoil, which, if seen in its entirety, will reveal a path through to the other side of the dilemma. One's relationship to God and to one another is critical, as it was to Zacchaeus and those who want to see something new, how to release themselves from a life that is bound up with the earth, culture, and society, and whatever behaviors they've been engaged in. Now, for Zacchaeus, there is always a way out of trouble, even when one is the cause of it. To let that spark of excitement that there is something new available to you, something that has lit up the lives of countless others, giving them a connection to God and a sense of direction. Zacchaeus caught that spark and responded, seeking to see Jesus. Now, whether Zacchaeus was converted already, as some scholars suggest, because of the verb I will give, has been translated by some as I have given. He may be running to see Jesus because his heart has already been converted by what he's heard about Jesus, about his teachings, and his offering of salvation. Perhaps he found hope for himself and a way out of his particular behaviors. Or if he has changed once in connection with Jesus because of that connection, we cannot say for sure, actually, which it was. However, there is something beautiful taking place. We can see Zacchaeus running in anticipation, perhaps even joy, climbing the tree. He repented. Thus, he found a way through the crowd to see. And once he'd encountered Jesus, he was being pulled in out of the raging waters and transformed into becoming a faithful disciple of Jesus. He's been restored to the community and part of the wave of the kingdom. And on the journey to Jerusalem, Jesus, in his final days on earth, looked up and saw Zacchaeus and called him down from the tree to draw him closer to himself, and invited himself to Zacchaeus' home to share in a meal. Today we are invited to share in such a meal that Jesus makes known to us God's acceptance of us, God's love for us, and through which we can grow in our love for one another. May we come in joy knowing that in our suffering, we are offered comfort, and together we'll find a path through the waves of the mighty storms in our lives. May we come in joy knowing that what seems insurmountable to us right now in our relationships, at work, in our community, in our health, and our well-being, with our ability to care for ourselves and one another, is not the whole picture. That the wisdom of God will open our eyes to see an easier way through. We don't have to flee or be confrontational or self-destructive. 2, that the wisdom of God can open our hearts of those who perpetrate wrongdoing, can come to be restored and be restored justice and loving actions. That the wisdom of God can open our hearts when we perpetrate wrongdoing. So when we repent, we can be restored to those we've harmed, and those can be restored to what is theirs. God's way is always present to us in the dynamics of our lives as we interact with those around us and with the whole of creation. The bread of heaven, the cup of healing and restoration, back to communion with God and in communion with each other. May we rejoice when we see it in ourselves and in others as we say, Amen.